The auction house smelled of dust and diesel, the kind of place where men in canvas jackets bid on dead strangers' belongings without asking who those strangers had been. Walter Pruitt stood near the back, hands in his pockets, watching lot after lot go to buyers who barely glanced at what they bought. He was 61, recently laid off from the plant, and had come that morning only because his neighbor said estate auctions sometimes turned up tools worth flipping for grocery money. When the toolbox came up, the room laughed. It was heavy steel, rusted at the corners, and someone had welded the lid shut completely, a thick, ugly seam running along every edge. The auctioneer joked that whoever bought it was buying a boat anchor, and the crowd chuckled along. Nobody wanted a box they couldn't open, except Walter, who felt something strange pull at him. A small, persistent voice he couldn't explain, and before he understood why, he raised his hand and said $60. The room laughed harder. $60 for scrap metal nobody could even use? The auctioneer shrugged, called it sold, and moved on to a set of usable wrenches that fetched twice as much. Walter loaded the box into his truck bed alone, ignoring the pitying looks from men who assumed he'd simply made a fool's mistake, the kind retired factory workers made when loneliness clouded their judgment. He drove home to the small house he'd shared with his late wife, Carol, until the cancer took her 18 months earlier. The silence in that house had become its own kind of weight, heavier some nights than others. And lately, Walter had taken to finding small projects just to keep his hands moving, because idle hands left too much room for grief to creep in. The toolbox sat in his garage until after dinner. When curiosity finally won out over exhaustion, he set up his angle grinder on the workbench, safety glasses pushed up over gray hair, and began cutting along the welded seam, sparks arcing into the dark garage like tiny orange fireflies. It took nearly 40 minutes of careful work before the lid finally gave way with a groan of tortured metal, and Walter lifted it open with hands that had gone strangely unsteady. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, he found letters. Dozens of them, tied with twine, addressed in handwriting he almost recognized from an old photograph album, though he couldn't place why. Beneath the letters sat a small velvet pouch containing a wedding ring far too delicate for any laborer's hands. And beneath that, a photograph of a young soldier standing beside a woman who bore an uncanny resemblance to Walter's own mother. Decades before Walter had ever been born, he read late into the night, piecing together a story his mother had never once mentioned. The soldier was her first husband, killed in Korea before Walter's father ever came into her life. The letters described a love cut short by war, a young widow's grief locked away and welded shut, quite literally, by a brother who couldn't bear to see her keep grieving a man everyone believed she should forget. The brother had sealed the box himself, intending to bury the past, and instead it had passed through an estate sale generations later. Ending up mocked by strangers who saw only rusted steel, Walter sat with those letters until dawn, understanding for the first time a sorrow his mother had carried silently her entire life, one she had folded away so completely that even her own son never knew to ask. He thought of Carol, of his own grief locked inside himself these past 18 months, welded shut in its own way. And he wept not just for the soldier and the young widow he'd never known, but for himself, and for how long a person could carry pain without ever cutting it open to let air reach it. In the months that followed, Walter tracked down a historian who specialized in Korean War correspondence, and together they arranged for the soldier's letters to be donated to a small veterans museum 2 counties over, where visitors could read about a love story nearly lost to time and neglect. Walter kept only the photograph and the ring, framing them together on the mantel where Carol's photograph already sat. 2 women he had loved in different ways, both taught to bear grief quietly, both finally given a voice. He told the story once at a diner to the neighbor who'd suggested the auction, and word spread through town the way small stories do, until people began calling it the $60 miracle. Strangers who had laughed loudest at that auction later admitted they wished they'd looked closer instead of joining the joke. A small lesson about how easily people mock what they don't understand. Walter never corrected them. though he knew the real miracle wasn't the box or its contents, but the reminder it gave him that whatever gets welded shut by pain can still be opened carefully and patiently by someone willing to sit with the sparks in the dark until something long buried finally sees light again. He kept the grinder in the garage after that, not for scrap metal, but as a quiet symbol that grief, however sealed away, was never meant to stay hidden forever.